The sun was setting over Marbella's coastline, casting a golden glow over luxury villas and quiet palm-lined streets. It was the kind of scene that had drawn the rich and powerful to Spain's Costa del Sol for decades. But on this evening, something far more sinister was happening behind the walls of one of those sprawling estates. Inside a multi-million-dollar mansion, a man lay dead, his blood pooling on the polished marble floor. His name was Andrei Petrov, a known associate of the Russian underworld. To the outside world, he was just another wealthy businessman. But to those familiar with Europe's criminal networks, his name carried weight. Petrov was a key figure in a powerful mafia empire stretching from Moscow to Madrid. When Spanish authorities arrived, they found no forced entry, no witnesses, no security footage, only the unmistakable signature of a professional hit. The silence surrounding the crime spoke volumes. This was no random killing. This was a message. What the investigation would soon uncover was far bigger than just one murder. It would expose a vast and highly organized criminal network that had infiltrated Spain, laundering billions, smuggling drugs and weapons, and operating in the shadows of Europe's wealthiest enclaves. This wasn't just a crime. It was the beginning of a war. To understand how Andrei Petrov ended up dead in a Marbella mansion, you have to go back to decades, to the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the early 1990s, as the old regime crumbled, chaos took over. Russia's economy collapsed, law enforcement was in disarray, and an entirely new class of criminals emerged. Organized crime wasn't just flourishing, it was evolving. Former KGB agents, corrupt politicians, and violent gangsters came together to seize power in the vacuum left by the Soviet collapse. Many of them stayed in Russia. Others looked westward, searching for a place to expand their empire. And for the Russian Mafia, no destination was more attractive than Spain. The Costa del Sol had everything they needed: a blooming real estate market, corruptible officials, and a climate where criminals could blend in with the European elite. At first, they came as investors, buying up high-end properties, nightclubs, and hotels. They poured money into Spain's economy, disguising themselves as successful businessmen, or quietly building one of Europe's most powerful crime syndicates. But real estate was just the beginning. By the late 1990s, it was clear that these weren't just wealthy Russians looking for a Mediterranean retreat. They were high-ranking mafia figures, using Spain as a base to launder dirty money, smuggle drugs, and expand their influence across Europe. The Spanish police at first underestimated the scale of the problem. The Russians weren't drawing attention to themselves with gang wars or street violence. Instead, they worked in the shadows, quietly funneling billions through banks and businesses. By the time authorities realized what was happening, the Russian mafia had already embedded itself deep within Spain's financial and political system. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving. As the Russian mafia tightened its grip on Spain, its operations expanded far beyond money laundering. What had started as a financial foothold in Europe quickly turned into a full-scale criminal empire. Drugs, arms, extortion, political corruption, no industry was off limits. The Russians were no longer just hiding money in Spain, they were running the underworld. Drug trafficking became one of their most lucrative operations. Cocaine shipments arrived from South America, hidden in containers passing through the ports of Valencia and Algeciras. The Russian mafia didn't just import the drugs, they controlled distribution across the continent, working alongside Spanish and Italian crime families. But drugs were only part of the business. The arms trade was even more dangerous. Former Soviet military stockpiles were quietly being emptied, their weapons finding their way into war zones, terrorist organizations, and criminal networks across Europe and the Middle East. Spanish law enforcement seized thousands of illegal firearms in major operations, but it barely put a dent in the overall trade. Then came the corruption. The mafia wasn't just making money, it was buying influence. Local politicians, police officers, and even judges were caught in their web. Investigations would later reveal deep connections between Russian crime bosses and Spanish officials, some of whom were found to have accepted bribes in exchange for turning a blind eye. Even when police managed to arrest key mafia figures, the cases often collapsed in court. Witnesses disappeared, evidence was missing, and legal loopholes allowed high-ranking criminals to walk free. By the early 2000s, the Russian-Spanish Mafia was nearly untouchable. They had the money, the connections, and the muscle to operate without fear. And as long as their businesses kept growing, no one dared to stop them. For years, the Russian Mafia thrived in Spain with almost complete impunity. Law enforcement agencies knew they were operating, but proving it was a different story. These criminals weren't like the street gangs or drug cartels that made headlines with shootouts and violent takeovers. They operated in the boardrooms, the luxury hotels, and the financial networks of Europe. The first major attempt to take them down came in 2005, when Spanish authorities launched Operation Troika. It was one of the most ambitious law enforcement actions against organized crime in Spain's history. The operation targeted high-ranking members of the Tambovskaya and Malyashevskaya crime syndicates, two of Russia's most powerful mafia groups. Authorities conducted over 30 raids, seizing properties, documents, and millions of euros in laundered money. Dozens of suspects were arrested, including top mafia figures who'd been hiding in plain sight for years. On the surface, it looked like a massive victory for Spanish law enforcement, but the celebration didn't last long. Despite the overwhelming evidence, many of the suspects were released within months. Some cases collapsed due to corrupt officials leaking information. Others were delayed in court until the charges expired. Key witnesses either vanished or changed their stories. It became clear that the mafia had infiltrated every level of Spain's legal system. Even when convictions were secured, they had little impact on the larger criminal network. Removing key individuals didn't dismantle the empire. It simply created vacancies that were quickly filled. The Russian Mafia was built like a hydra. Cut off one head and two more take its place. And as law enforcement struggled to keep up, the violence escalated. The Russian Mafia in Spain wasn't a single unified organization. It was a collection of rival clans, each with their own leaders, enforcers, and money-making operations. And like any empire built on crime, power struggles were inevitable. Between 2010 and 2015, a series of high-profile assassinations sent shockwaves through Spain's underworld. These weren't random killings. They were precise, calculated eliminations, designed to shift the balance of power. One of the first major hits came in 2012, when a Georgian crime boss known as the Banker was gunned down outside his Marbella mansion. He'd been handling multi-million euro money laundering operations for the Russian Mafia, but had started keeping a little too much for himself. His execution was swift, his killers never found. In 2014, another high-profile killing took place in Barcelona. A former Russian intelligence officer who'd defected and started working with European authorities was found dead in his apartment. The official cause was listed as suicide, but investigators suspected he'd been silenced before he could testify in a major case. And then there were the disappearances. Several mid-level mafia associates, including accountants, smugglers, and informants, simply vanished. No bodies, no suspects, no investigations. The message was clear. Loyalty was not optional. These murders sent a chilling warning, not just to those inside the criminal world, but to Spanish authorities as well. If they thought they could dismantle the Russian Mafia, they needed to be prepared for a long and bloody war. Despite years of investigations, raids, and arrests, the Russian-Spanish Mafia remained one step ahead. European law enforcement agencies tightened regulations on money laundering, increased cooperation across borders, and passed through tougher anti-mafia laws. But the Mafia kept adapting. When Spain cracked down on real estate investments, they moved their money through cryptocurrency and offshore accounts. When banks imposed stricter regulations, they used fake business fronts and cash-intensive industries. Every time a door closed, another opened. The problem wasn't just in Spain. The Russian Mafia's reach extended across Europe, with operations in Germany, the UK, and even Switzerland. Their influence wasn't just criminal, it was political. Investigators uncovered deep connections between mafia bosses and high-ranking politicians, some of whom deliberately slowed down legal proceedings to protect their criminal partners. By the mid-2010s, some law enforcement officials quietly admitted that completely dismantling the Russian Mafia was nearly impossible. Arresting individuals was not enough. The system itself was compromised. For every case that made it to trial, there were dozens more that disappeared in a maze of bureaucracy and corruption. It was no longer a question of if the Russian Mafia could be stopped, it was a question of whether anyone even had the power to fight them. The Russian mafia had embedded itself deep within Spain's economy, its political landscape, and its financial system. Law enforcement had launched high-profile operations, but time and time again, the cases fell apart in court, leaving major crime figures free to continue their operations. In theory, Spain had all the tools to dismantle these networks. Anti-mafia laws had been strengthened, international cooperation between Europol, Interpol, and Spanish law enforcement had increased. But even with greater resources, prosecutors struggled to build solid cases. One of the biggest challenges was evidence. Many mafia transactions took place off the books, hidden well behind shell companies and offshore accounts. Money flowed through real estate, fake investments, and luxury businesses, making it nearly impossible to trace. When investigators froze assets, the criminals simply moved their money elsewhere before authorities could react. Another issue was corruption. In several high-profile cases, Spanish politicians and officials were found to have direct financial links to Russian oligarchs. These connections didn't just slow down investigations, they actively protected key mafia figures from prosecution. Even when authorities managed to arrest top members of these crime networks, they rarely stayed in prison for long. Witnesses disappeared, evidence was lost. Some trials dragged on for so many years that the statutes of limitations expired before verdicts could be reached. It was becoming clear. Traditional law enforcement wasn't enough. The Russian mafia wasn't just a criminal empire, it was a system that had learned to survive within the cracks of European law and politics. As Spanish and European authorities struggled to contain the Russian mafia, a new challenge emerged. Russia's geopolitical influence was expanding, and with it, so was the reach of its criminal networks. The lines between businesses, politics, and organized crime were becoming blurred. Oligarchs, once seen as mere financiers of the underworld, were now active players in global politics. Sanctions against Russian billionaires meant to cut off criminal funding had unintended consequences. Instead of stopping the money flow, these measures forced the Russian mafia to evolve, leading to even more sophisticated laundering operations. Cryptocurrencies, decentralized banking, and encrypted communication networks made tracking their movements harder than ever. At the same time, Russia's own security services were accused of using criminal networks to achieve political goals. The same syndicates that had once smuggled drugs and laundered money were now facilitating intelligence operations, hacking campaigns, and covert influence efforts. Europe was now facing a criminal empire that was no longer just about profit. It was about power. The question was no longer just whether Spain could fight back. The real question was whether all of Europe could stop what was coming. Despite the scale of the problem, some European leaders still refused to acknowledge the full extent of Russian organized crime's influence. Tougher anti-corruption laws, financial regulations, and cross-border intelligence operations have helped slow the mafia's expansion, but they haven't stopped it. Criminal organizations have proven far more adaptable than governments, constantly shifting their methods to stay ahead of the law. Authorities are fighting a war against an invisible empire, one that doesn't need public recognition or territories to maintain control. If nothing changes, the Russian mafia will only grow stronger, its power extending beyond Spain, beyond Europe, into global markets, politics, and conflicts. At this point, the fight against them isn't just about crime. It's about who really holds power in Europe. And if governments don't act soon, they may no longer be the ones making the rules.